Hello and welcome to the Gifted Ed podcast. I am your host, Meghan McCarthy, clinical social worker. We're grateful for the opportunity to share this space with you today as we talk about the complexities of giftedness. Today we welcome Stephanie Butler, Alissa Prestwich, and Elizabeth Foran to discuss the role of content specialists. Stephanie is currently a math specialist and is in her 9th year as an educator. She has a bachelor's degree in mathematics and a master's in secondary education.
With gifted learners, understanding that asynchronous development is a huge piece of it and how to meet students where they're at and really continue to challenge them.
Stephanie has a passion for problem solving, developing confidence, and creating an engaging, fun experience for students while learning math. Alissa is a literacy specialist. She has a bachelor's degree in elementary education and a master's degree in literacy with a focus on reading.
In a teacher's perfect world, all the students would arrive in August, remembering everything they've learned in all past grades, and they'd pick up on new concepts at the same pace as their peers, but that's not actually the reality of working with children.
She is currently working with students in kindergarten through 2nd grade, and she previously worked in public schools as a 1st and 2nd grade classroom teacher, a reading specialist, and as a private reading tutor. Lastly, Elizabeth is a lower school literacy specialist. She has a master's in education in language and literacy and holds a secondary education license and a reading specialist license.
The expectations for students of this generation, go beyond the content. And so there is an expectation that you think like a scientist, but also that you write like a scientist and that you read like a scientist. And so teachers can benefit from having a literacy specialist on staff to come in and say, hey, my expertise is in the content. Your expertise is in the skill here. Can we work and partner together?
Throughout her career, she has worked in private and public secondary schools in the capacity of teacher, specialist, and instructional coach. Welcome to the Gifted Ed podcast, Stephanie, Alissa, and Elizabeth.
Thank you for having us.
So I'd love to start our conversation today to get a better sense of the role content specialists play in schools. So Elizabeth, can you kind of talk us through what this looks like as a literacy specialist?
Sure. I think what's interesting is how each school can imagine this position. And the way that I think about it is informed from my licensing program, where we thought about it as reading specialist versus literacy coach. And so I think when schools have a position that they consider to be a reading specialist or a literacy specialist, they're thinking of them usually as an interventionist, someone who is a content area specialist and can really advise teachers on students and maybe on curriculum as well, based on their expertise. So that involves pulling out students who might need more intervention. It might look like some push-in to support small group work. But then when you have someone who's labeled literacy coach, you're probably looking at more of a support system for teachers, a collaborator, somebody who's very kind of goal-oriented. And oftentimes that takes the form of coaching cycles where the literacy coach works with teachers on specific goals and cycles through multiple lessons to try to help them improve student outcomes. In both of those cases, though, I think what's important is that the specialist is non-evaluative, and so they can create a safe space for the teacher to try new things, to come to them with questions, and really be a good collaborator. So it's kind of a long answer because I don't think there is one way that it has to look, but I do think that they just have to meet the needs of the teachers and the students in that school.
Is it fair to say then, as a reading specialist, you are directly working with students, whereas a literacy coach, you're directly working with teachers?
That is how it generally is divided, but there's, of course, a lot of blurred lines depending on what the school needs and what other types of resources they have. If they don't feel like they have a good professional development program, then there might be more work for a reading specialist with teachers than in a school where you already have designated coaches who can support professional learning. So I do think of it that way, but then that's where your kind of job description and your relationship with your superiors come in handy to know what your actual responsibilities should be in your school.
That makes sense. And then Stephanie, how does this compare to the role of a math specialist?
Sure, there's lots of similarities. I really echo everything that Elizabeth mentioned. The only additional piece would be specialists are often brought in because they can see the vertical alignment across grades. So the way that our model works is we work with kindergarten through fourth grade. So the specialist comes in and can see benchmarks or curriculum that's used from kindergarten through fourth grade and often see alignment or content gaps across grades. And this can be really helpful in identifying and addressing specific areas that students can work on. So that's one of the benefits of having a specialist is to see the alignment across grades. And additionally, the way that our school structures the specialist role, we work with students both in remediation and we look at extension, which can sometimes also lead to acceleration. That's really specific to our gifted population that we have and asynchronous development, which maybe we can touch on later. But this allows us to kind of look at the full scope of skills that students need and focus at both the remediation level and the extension level.
And I know we can touch on that later, but that is such a key piece with the gifted population to be able to service the asynchronous learning on both kind of ends of the spectrum, if you will. And Alissa, from your role as a literacy specialist, how does one determine kind of push in versus pull out services?
Yeah, so our intervention is based on the data that we collect throughout the year and the recommendations of the teachers that see these students every day. At our school, we have established benchmarks that we expect our students to meet at certain points in the year. And we assess students in each grade level and take note of the students who are not meeting those benchmarks. From this data, we discuss with teachers how often students need to meet with a specialist and whether they'll be best served in a small pull-out group or in a push-in group in the classroom. The main difference between those, in general, pull-out groups tend to lean more towards specific gaps that the students might have in their knowledge or their skills set that need to be addressed and practiced, while push-in services tend to focus on the same information that the rest of the class is learning, just with a little bit more support or scaffolding in a small group.
Okay. I feel like I hear the word data a lot, and it seems like using that piece, and I know working with you three too, just the importance of that and kind of having the data and the numbers guide decisions while also then taking a step back and looking at the class as a whole, the student as a whole, kind of balancing those two, it sounds like is a big part of your job.
Yes, absolutely.
So when we think of the work that you do in the context of our gifted population, how do the needs of the gifted learner impact your work? And I think it would be helpful for us to kind of walk through this question from each of your own perspectives as you do such amazing work.
I'll go first. I think it's important to note that just because students are gifted, it does not mean that they never encounter a subject or a concept that is hard for them. They're still children, they're learning new things. So when a student is recommended to see a specialist, it's not an indication that they're not gifted in any way. They simply need a little extra support in that area. I think another thing to note is that we know so much right now about the stages of learning how to read. We know that it's kind of a pathway with skills like stepping stones, and that children must master each of those skills to move on to the next and become a proficient reader. In general, these skills have been assigned to age groups or grade levels, but with a gifted population, those children might master these skills sooner than their same-aged peers, but they're still on that same pathway. So our job is to take note of where they are and just move them forward to the next skill.
Just to highlight, it's such an important part that you just said is just because students may need your services doesn't mean they're not gifted. I feel like that needs its own point for probably parents, for teachers, for for students themselves. That's such an important piece that might not always be is easily understood potentially.
Yeah, and I think that when and with parents as well, right? I mean, when your child is
That's
labeled
scary.
as gifted and then they do encounter something that's hard for them, parents get nervous too. Like, wait, was this mislabeled? But it's not. This is completely normal with all populations of children.
So I think also in this same vein, there's a lot of instruction that can be done in the classroom that is implicit with our gifted learners, where by that I mean they can investigate and do some really deep and wonderful thinking to learn new concepts. But when you're learning something new and it is challenging, the benefits of explicit instruction can't be overstated. And so I think one thing that we see is when we have this gifted population and we're able to provide them with maybe, let's say, a pullout service, we can provide them with explicit instruction that they don't necessarily always need on every topic, and may not even always want. They love to explore and think and really dive in and get their hands dirty on a lot of topics. But when we're talking about foundational reading skills, it's wonderful to have an opportunity to receive explicit instruction on something that's difficult. And the way that might look is through a multisensory approach, which is also incredibly beneficial. And that's true whether you're gifted or not. And I think that the multisensory approach that we can provide in a person setting is what helps them to rejoin their peers and close the gap on whatever skill it is that they're struggling with. So we want to make sure that they're seeing, saying, hearing, feeling the content that we're expecting them to master. And we can just do that in a much more explicit way when we have push-in opportunities. And pull-out opportunities, actually.
Yeah, I can kind of add to that too from the math perspective, the benefits of working in a pull-out group and exploring those multisensory different means of instruction. In math, I'm thinking like students get to work with their own set of manipulatives. That's typically something that can be harder to master in a class of 20 students where every student gets spaced 10 blocks. But the advantage of having a small pull-out group of 3 to 4 students, every student gets their own hands-on experience, working at the pace that the student needs, and perhaps looking through different models, so like concrete, a representation, and then moving to the abstract. The other piece that I wanted to touch on too with gifted learners is the asynchronous development that we talked a little bit about earlier. Gifted students are known for asynchronous development where they may be highly advanced in one or more subject areas and then on level developmentally, academically, social emotionally, and all other levels. Oftentimes what we see at our school is a math level that is 1 to 2 grades beyond that of their peer group or that of the grade that they're placed in. So we have found and developed processes and procedures to accelerate students into what is the most appropriate peer group for them to learn math. This might look very different at other schools. It could be at our school, we have first graders taking 3rd grade math, and there are absolutely challenges that come with that. But academically, it is where those students belong. But there are absolutely challenges in terms of staffing or scheduling or ways to support it. But with gifted learners, understanding that asynchronous development is a huge piece of it and how to meet students where they're at and really continue to challenge them.
And it kind of goes back to that kind of whole child part, right? And something that kind of came up just previously when you guys were talking about it is just the opportunity for the repetition and the foundational skills being there. I could imagine, like in your office and small group, I could imagine then allows them to have the space for the curiosity, for kind of the free thinking, problem solving, because, while the foundation skills are being strengthened, they have the space then to kind of lean into the bigger conversations in their classroom with their peers, which is obviously huge.
Yeah, I think it builds a lot of confidence. I think it has a lot of benefits outside of just learning the skill, because they certainly are incredibly bright and bring to the office what they're learning, whether or not, that's what we're focused on that day. And so there's a definite bridge. And I think the confidence that they walk away with hopefully is well worth the time that they come to see us.
Yeah. Elizabeth, what are some ways that content specialists can collaborate with teachers?
Well, I think there's so many different ways. And in my former role as literacy coach, I was able to interact and collaborate with teachers in a myriad of ways. And now it looks different in my new role, which is very exciting. And so I think at the most foundational level, and if we always are remembering what this is really about, which is our students, we first always have to collaborate around the data, like we talked about earlier, looking at it, collecting it oftentimes at the beginning of the year as you're assessing every individual student on their foundational literacy skills. It's great to lend a hand. You get to know the students as the specialist, and then you also can assist the teacher, who usually is very happy to have that extra hand as
Yes.
much as possible. So you collect it, you look at it, and then can provide that intervention that we've been speaking about this the majority of this time. But then when you have that positive rapport with the teachers, and going back to what I said earlier about if you're in a non-evaluative role, hopefully they have some trust in you and some interest in working with you. You can create assignments and co-teach. Certainly creating assessments is a significant part of the role that I've experienced, where you can help them craft something that they feel really good about giving their students to assess what they've learned. And then Stephanie hit on this earlier. I think another great way to collaborate with teachers is to bring the perspective of seeing across grade levels, because you will intervene with 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds and 8-year-olds. You have been able to see where maybe there are gaps, where there are strengths, different strategies that are working well, and bring groups of teachers together. And they generally love that opportunity to have really organic professional development from their own peers. It's hard to make time for that. And so if the specialist can be the motivator, I think that's a really valuable role.
As I'm hearing you answer this question, and I know you three do it so beautifully, just the vulnerability. I think that you guys see that you might not, people might not think of, but the vulnerability students and the risk students have to take to kind of not know something as a gifted learner, I think is huge. I think for teachers to lean into you and use you as a safe place for support, I think is another big thing. And that sometimes we kind of just think of it as skill learning, but I think there's such a big piece here that's like a bigger picture, which is we're all learning and we're all students, and just kind of normalizing that for students and teachers to kind of lean on each other is big.
I think it definitely makes the specialist job easier when you're in an environment where teachers feel safe to be vulnerable and they have encouragement from their administrators to take risks. When you come into a school and that isn't the environment, then it becomes part of your job to try to build trust, even just one-on-one. If that's not the culture of the school, how can they trust you? And when they do, I think you'll have a much better day.
Huge. Yep. And Stephanie, what are the biggest constraints to fitting your work into the school day?
Sure. So this can definitely look different from school to school. At our school, in math, I support kindergarten through 4th grade. So this looks like balancing then 5 different grade levels schedules. We have found success in creating a workshop time for small group pullout. This has been beneficial so then students are not missing core class time to work on skills that they need support in. So creating a different time of day, like a workshop or a flex time for pullout purposes. And then in addition to that, balancing all the push-in time as well. So you're working with 5 different grade level schedules to kind of create your master schedule of all of the times that you're supporting teachers and students. Another challenge that we face is oftentimes students who see both specialists. So with that workshop time in mind, that's split between math and literacy. And there are times when we are working with students and they need support in both. So how do we balance math needs and literacy needs? And then I'd say the last piece, which really touches on everything Elizabeth was mentioning of a really strong collaboration with teachers, requires time. So in order for us to build that rapport, develop that collaboration and dynamic with teachers where we have strong communication, we're on the same page, even the kind of collaboration in the classroom of what that might look like in push-in, that requires time for us to meet with teachers. So now you're working with our hectic schedule and a teacher's hectic schedule, and all teachers know that, time is not something that we have a ton of. So that's another one of the challenges that we face.
Probably the biggest or most important resource in a school is time.
Not enough hours in the day.
No. Alissa, I'm curious what the biggest benefits of schools having content specialists on site. What your kind of thoughts are on that.
Right. So I feel like I'm mostly just echoing what we've said in this entire episode. But But like we've said, having content specialists on site really it's to give support to students and to teachers. In a teacher's perfect world, all the students would arrive in August, remembering everything they've learned and all past grades and previous classrooms, and they'd pick up on new concepts at the same pace as their peers. But that's not actually the reality of working with children or working with people in general. So teachers are great at doing their best to meet these needs of each of these students. But there are times when students need more, whether that's remediation or extension, or teachers have done everything that they can think of to reach a student, and they're just still at a loss. And so I think that's really where having a content specialist on site comes into play. We come in, we can help provide that collection of data, the pull-in, the push-in services, that time that students might need for the multisensory approaches, for all of these things that we've been talking about. And then on the teacher side, we can also help coach and co-teach and model strategies that we know. And just like the finer details of our content specialty that teachers might not have the depth of knowledge from just their education. So we're an outside eye that can help teachers and help students with more explicit instruction or extra practice. And like Elizabeth has been saying, it's just a space that has no judgment, because we're not administrators. We're not your boss. We're just, we're here to help, and we're here to give the support that students and teachers need.
And I think, Alissa, going back to what you were saying about how we have this expertise, it's making me think too, back when I worked with older students, so in high school, and teachers are well trained and well versed in their content areas, and that's how our licensure programs are set up. But the expectations for students of this generation, go beyond the content. And so from the literacy perspective, there is an expectation that you think like a scientist, but also that you write like a scientist and that you read like a scientist. And so science teachers, just as an example, really can benefit from having a literacy specialist on staff to come in and say, hey, my expertise is in the content. Your expertise is in the skill here. Can we work and partner together? And I see that in the lower grades too, because they can't be experts in everything either. And it's nice to be able to partner with somebody who has their expertise and you have yours, and then hopefully you can pass something back between you to become, a stronger teacher on both ends.
And I think knowing how important time is, like we've already said, the amount of time that you save, because you don't have to do the translation, because you guys are in our system, you get it, you speak the same language. Sometimes there's wonderful recommendations we get from outside specialists, but it's like, ooh, how do we make that work for our setting? How do we make that work for our classroom? How do we make that work for our kids? And since we already speak the same language, I feel like that's just such a time save right there, because you get what really could work in our setting for our kids, because it's not just an isolated one child that you see, but not in the whole context, because that obviously changes everything. I just want to say thank you so much to all three of you, Stephanie, Alissa, and Elizabeth, for your time today, for such a thoughtful discussion. We're just so grateful for your expertise today. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for having us. This was fun.
So we want to leave you today with a reflection question and a call to action. So for a reflection question is, how has today's conversation influenced your view of how you could collaborate with a content specialist to support your students? And something we'd want you to try. So given our conversation today, it's a two-parter. So the first is, if you do have a content specialist in your school, try using them as a safe place to take a risk on something new while getting that content-specific feedback. Or if your school doesn't have a content specialist, we encourage you to find a peer in your school who you can lean on to get content-specific support and resources, as well as bounce ideas off of. We want to thank you for joining us in this space today. Please subscribe to the Gifted Ed podcast to stay up to date with our latest episodes. Stay tuned for our next episode that continues to unpack the complexities of giftedness.